If you want to do the A versus B, C versus D, then go to
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Everybody has a persona, but at least they need to be a friendly in this space.
I think it also means like we are going to deep dive into issues.
So, all good?
Yeah, that's fine.
Fantastic.
Okay. Hi, welcome everyone. This is the fifth episode of the India Dialogue. We're so grateful that you're willing to give us a listen. My name is Ruchir. Unfortunately, Guru's not able to make it this week, but we're joined by our ever wonderful group, starting with Mitali Mukherjee, formerly of CNBC, currently at the Reuters Institute, and Manu Shanmugan Sundaram, or Manu, who's an advocate with his own law practice and is also a spokesperson for DMK. I'm the CEO at Distributed Energy and chair at School of Policy and Governance. We're doing this because we care about India and we want to discuss issues in a way that adds value. We're all friends and want to discuss issues without any slogans, with friendly disagreements, um, whether the issues are sensitive or not. For now, this is an experiment that we want to run in the build up to 2024 national elections. Um, on that note, we get this going. Today, Mitali will moderate the first issue. Mitali?
Thanks for that, Ruchir. Yeah, it's great that you're keeping count. I haven't kept count, but I just feel like we've moved through so many waves of so much important news that I think it's a very timely conversation to be having ahead of the elections. So let's start off with the electoral bonds, something that really captured a lot of attention over the last week, something in which the Supreme Court had some fairly sharp comments to make. So let's break this up into context of what this was, why it was seen as something that was quite restrictive in terms of right to information, and what it means for the money environment generally for the electoral landscape. Manu, let me start with you on all those three counts, but let's first do a little bit of context setting for anyone who was wondering what's the big hoo-ha about with electoral bonds.
There is a lot of hoo-ha about electoral bonds. I'm glad you used that word, and you also were right when you said the Supreme Court has sort of put a end point to the electoral bonds with very sharp comments. But can we begin with how long it has taken the Supreme Court to come up with these sharp comments? Uh,
7 years.
seven solid years, right? And I compare this with other cases typically in similar common law jurisdictions in the United Kingdom, where I remember once when Prime Minister Boris Johnson had prorogued or closed Parliament, the three forums in the United Kingdom went through appeals and wrapped up the entire case because it involved a matter of great national importance within 2 to 3 months. And here, for to hear one challenge to electoral bonds or whatever it is, but definitely it is a matter of great importance to the fundamental democratic fabric of our country. It has taken the Supreme Court 6 to 7 years, and I think therein, I think there is a lot to unpack just there. But you know, criticism of the Supreme Court's sort of general delay and tendency aside, electoral bonds is a scheme that was brought in by the present government, by the earlier government, but by the BJP dispensation through amendments in the Finance Act, Companies Act, and even the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, right? It's really interesting if you split it. First, the earlier regimes had allowed political donations through different forms. There were electoral trusts, and as you know, there's always been a huge cash play when it comes to political donations. Now, the reasoning that was given by the then BJP government is that we want to reduce the amount of infusion of cash into as political donations, so into political parties. So therefore, we've come up with this ingenious method of buying corporates or companies may buy bonds. Now, by doing that, they change a few things. Fundamentally, they remove a earlier placed cap. There was a cap that only 7.5% of the annual profit of a company that made profit uh, could actually be given as political donation. So they removed that. Essentially, that is one of the main limb of the arguments before the Supreme Court, wherein petitioners argued against the bond, saying that a shell company or a loss-making company typically could be set up or could be uh, cleverly used to make political donations. So that was one major issue. Then, secondly, the issue of foreign contributions. We've seen over the last 4 5 years a huge crackdown in terms of foreign funds coming into civil society organizations, right? And a lot of civil society organizations, Amnesty, Greenpeace, etc., facing a lot of, or rather increased restrictions. Now, interestingly, foreign contribution restrictions for political funding were actually loosened. So this is another sort of interesting point that was considered. But by and large, Mitali, like you said, I think the right to information, which is established way back in early 2000s in a couple of cases, one called Common Cause and other called the Association for Democratic Reforms, wherein the Supreme Court held that a voter, a citizen who is a voter, has a fundamental right to know about the criminal antecedents of their candidates, also the assets and liabilities of their candidates. So the Supreme Court specifically in a couple of cases, one called Common Cause and one called the Association for Democratic Reforms, laid down guidelines which required every candidate in every election in legislative assembly or parliament to disclose all the criminal antecedents, so any FIR that has been lodged against them or a charge sheet, and also assets and liabilities of every candidate. When that is the particular sort of importance given to right to know your political candidate, it's quite strange that this electoral bond scheme brought complete opacity or complete sort of hiddenness to the funding that is given to political parties. Now, it has been said that no, the funding for the political parties is not directly for elections, though it's called electoral bonds. Parties can use it for anything but elections, right? They can use it to build more offices, they can use it to run social media campaigns throughout the year, meaning it's not election only. But having said that, parties can also use this money for elections. They can also run ad campaigns across newspapers. Of
Yeah.
course, they have to run it past the election commission, but that's the problem. So that dichotomy between the right to information, the right to know your candidate, and the right to know who contributed or made donations to your political party, I think that is one of the factors that weighed very heavily. And the other one was, of course, it's an interesting sort of flip of what I would say the Obama model. Okay, when 2007, when Obama ran for his presidential election, he really took a different view or an interesting view to how to raise political funding or campaign funding. Obama sought money from everyone. He sought $5, $10, $20 contributions, right? This was his way of saying, I don't need only the big corporates, the corporate giants to contribute, though I'm sure corporate biggies also contributed. But nevertheless, I think it was an interesting change in how American election funding happened. Now, it was interesting, almost 10 years after the Obama campaign funding moment, we now have political parties who pretty much, only got money from the richest corporates. Why do I say that? Because it's there in the judgment delivered by the Supreme Court. So over 54% of the money that came was in 1 crore blocks. So obviously, it is not, your even medium sized or even mid to large sized company, right? And almost, I'd say, around 20% came in 10 lakh blocks. So therefore, pretty much three-fourths of it came from companies, corporates, which were quite large, quite well funded, and quite well resourced. So the interesting, and I think the most sort of what people have called the last mile judgment of this particular order is that the Supreme Court has walked the last mile to not just say that electoral bond scheme is unconstitutional, for violating Article 19 and Article 14, but also has asked State Bank of India to disclose to the Election Commission of India what each of the parties have actually received as electoral bond funding over the last 7 8 years. Interestingly, when Election Commission was asked, in the Supreme Court during the arguments, do you must have this information, right? Election Commission said no. We There's an order in 2019 by the Supreme Court which said please collect information that has been given in 2019. We took it to mean only to collect information that was of 20 financial year 2019. We did not collect anything after that. So that is why Supreme Court specifically has asked now for State Bank of India, which is the issuing bank, the bank that issues the electoral bonds, to share information with the Election Commission, and subsequently and consequently for Election Commission of India to put up these disclose these funding on their website or by or on March 15th. So I think that, I guess, is the way that Supreme Court has finally shown the sunlight on this entire electoral bonds, and broken through the opacity. And so come March 15th, we're going to have some interesting information on not just who funded, but when these were encashed. And why is this particularly important? You will have not only a pie chart saying who got how much money, but you will have a timeline of who got money when. And then you will have on your right hand side, and I think this is going to be a very interesting sort of task for journalists across India to start putting together what are the government orders, bills, or policy decisions that were made, that were connected to that company donation, or that company which gave the donation around that period of time. So will it establish quid pro quo? It may very well, we do not know. But I think that's now very interesting, because as you all probably know, from March 15th we will definitely be knee deep, if not neck deep, in election campaign. So this could very well become a very key election issue. I might just say one last thing, for all of those who say, shows a scam, by the BJP or any other party, um, could this be something that they could actually use to say that, look, I can link this particular policy decision to this particular funding, and does that establish quid pro quo in a court of law, or amongst the people, as election campaign reaches fever pitch? I think that is the part that I feel is the really landmark part. Not that electoral bonds were struck down for being unconstitutional. I think most people decided and sort of felt that way from the very beginning. But I think it's how this may or may not ultimately impact the 2024 elections to the Lok Sabha that I find particularly of great interest.
Yeah. And I do have a follow-up question for you, Manu, but I want to get Ruchir in. And before I do that, you talked a little bit about the history of what happened with the court itself. Um, there's a little bit of history, I think, for people who are interested about what happened with what one would think, or who one would think is the natural authoritative voice on that, the Reserve Bank. And when this suggestion was made 7 years back, the Reserve Bank actually wrote a very, very sharp note, saying this would set a bad precedent. It could encourage money laundering. The bonds, which are called bearer bonds, are transferable, which makes them extremely opaque, as you said, extremely anonymous. So it's quite interesting that in the backdrop of that kind of feedback, it still slid through. And I know that it slid through in record time in terms of finance ministry clearance. It finally came into being. It took about a year, but the actual green lighting of it moved very fast. But Richard, on this quid pro quo bit, this is a little bit ironic, because if you break it up in terms of what kind of state collections were made through these electoral bonds, you will find a relation between the winning party of a state government as well, and the
Yeah.
fact that that particular party garnered the most, whether it's in Telangana, whether it's in West Bengal. In that election year, the party that came to power was the party that garnered a chunk of the electoral bonds. I- Is it a is it kind of a given for industry to back a winning horse and hence donate generously to the winning horse?
I want to zoom in on your point about donations versus bond. These are actually donations, and interestingly, um, they've been termed as electoral bonds. It's such a political thing to do, to name it something that obfuscates or changes reality for people. Um, I think the other part around this being, although it is a mechanism of financing that was introduced by the BJP, it's actually benefited a lot of state governments, and they've used this as a mechanism to move money relatively easily. So I think one of the things to bear in mind is this has facilitated the oil of the political machine. Um, I think back to the 2013 election of relating to Manu's example of Obama. That was a really good um, election just for one reason, which was that everyone donated money and the donations were made public. I think if we can have that as a standard moving forward, where the expectation of a donation is the expectation is that every donation to a political party will be made public, would make a big difference. I hope that is what comes out of it. But having said that, our system has consistently allowed for spaces where money can move freely. So, and in politics, I don't expect that to change anytime soon. So I worry that this system will be replaced by another bad mechanism for political parties to fund their setup, by having special purpose vehicles or companies that funnel money for political purposes, and it's not clear how they make that money.
Manu, I have a follow up question to the point that you were making. I mean, the thing is, if you separate this into two halves, as Ruchir is saying, one is the constitutional element of this, and this was clearly not, not sitting with, as you said, transparency. This was not sitting with right to information, and that was quite rightly struck down. On the point about, will this make a big impact to what happens to funding for political parties? I mean, if you were to just stretch the line between elections in 98 to 2019, the cost, and these are stunning stats, so it might be nice for people listening and watching to hear that the cost in terms of election expenditure from 98 to 2019 went from 9,000 crores to 55,000 crores. I mean, the 2019 Lok Sabha elections were the most expensive elections, ever seen. And a chunk of that spend happened by BJP. Now, if you contrast that against what collections they made from electoral bonds, it's a drop in the ocean. Is it your sense that this will make a material impact on the kind of funding available to political parties? And I'll just add another rider to that, which is off the record. What some of the political parties shared was, in this big brother atmosphere, they get nothing right now in terms of open donations. So electoral bonds might have been a way for them to get a little bit instead of getting nothing. Is that a legitimate sort of concern?
I think the answer sort of to legitimate electoral bonds is a more legitimate bond system, right? I mean, the it cannot be that. I don't think striking down the entire bonds system is what is required. What the Supreme Court has said is that it has struck down the electoral bonds scheme on the twin conditions of lack of transparency. So essentially, it's the Supreme Court has said that there is a right to know your political party, the right to know who's funding your political party, and how much is being funded. So therefore, and more open system similar to what Suchir had spoken about with regard to disclosure of funding. That is, I think, what the essence of the judgment is, firstly. Of course, I think there are problems with. I think the Supreme Court felt quite odd that any company could be set up to route money into political funding for political funding. I think that they felt is wrong. They felt that there needs to be some eligibility criteria. Now, even if you want to apply for a very simple, a small tender, in a municipal corporation, the eligibility criteria would require that you have certain expertise, certain experience. You must have, done this work for 3 years or so, and so on and so forth, right?
Mm.
So I think they want to apply some standards, not be similar standards, but some standards to say only these kind of companies. So therefore, weeding out shell companies, therefore weeding out special vehicles to move money in, as a circuitous route and not as a direct political donation. So I think that seems to be the essence of the judgment. Of course, we do not know what this will lead to, and of course, I don't believe for one moment, and I don't think any one of us does that. Cash has reduced in the last 6 years,
Mm.
post demonetization and post introduction of electoral bonds in any way, right? Because you do realize that a lot of the cash for votes culture actually requires it to be in cash, and I don't think for one moment that donations that are coming into political parties are being liquidated into cash. So there is still cash flow into elections, into political sort of work, into campaign related activities, and that cash component is there because that's the only way you can give. And also keep in mind the other fact, right? Because if you're going to think of electoral reforms, it has to be quite comprehensive, it can't be piecemeal. You also realize that there is also a cap on the amount of expenditure that every candidate can spend. I think for Lok Sabha it is around 95 lakhs. For a legislative assembly election, it's around 45 lakhs. So
Yeah.
therefore, once somebody comes, they've spent around 94 lakhs, they immediately would probably will move to cash if they have to spend more money. So there's all these sort of realities, not that for anyone for one moment will justify cash for votes, or campaign expenditure in cash, but these are the realities that are there. And of course, this is why our election expenditure this year will, I would say, well be in the 120,000 crore mark. I mean, that is what we are going to look at, right, in terms of how much the country has also grown, the expectations of what a campaign has grown. Of course, as you all know, campaigning is extremely lucrative business. There's so many more political consulting agencies, so many more digital marketing agencies, and so on and so forth. So I think we're looking at a totally different ball game. I don't see any government intervention or ordinance to bring about a reformed bonds or electoral bond scheme at this moment. I think for the moment, BJP at last count has around 6,000 odd crores. Congress, maybe around 500 or so. But nevertheless, I think the powers that be have enough in the kitty for this election, right? So it is
Yeah.
obviously going to be something that we will see after the once the new government is formed, come May or June 2024.
But I think March
There's
is
something
there.
quite.
Yeah.
I was gonna say there's something quite nice about the principle of having caps on spending for campaign seats because it allows hopefully the non-party affiliated person to run in a seat and have a level playing field.
Yeah.
The one of the opportunities here is also whether if we did make it clean, could we have rewards for making it clean? Is there a way where the state machinery gives you more support because you are extremely open, honest, transparent about campaigning? That would be a really interesting outcome. Of course, we're far away from it because the obfuscation right now is so beneficial that I don't know if any party, forget the ruling party, any party would support it.
No, you're right, Ruchir, and it's not an example to hold up as sort of the epitome of free and fair elections, but just what happened in Pakistan over the last few weeks. In a lot of the smaller constituencies, those that were standing for re-election were, it's a generational vote. These people have been winning that seat for decades on end. And this time round, for the first time, you had 20, 25-year-olds from PTI or standing as independents saying, I'm going to take you on. And they actually won, and they're protesting that, because we all know that that ballot counting something went very wrong in those 72 hours. But as you say, the moment you democratize the process, or at least make it a more fair ground, saying you can't go willy nilly just spending as much as your capacity is, you open up the space for newer contenders to come in. So
But just let me just say one more point on this, right? I mean, having worked on about four elections so far, the level of scrutiny is actually quite high. Way back in 2019, the last Lok Sabha election, I worked as one of the main sort of party coordinators for a constituency, and the amount of resources that Election Commission of India uses to make sure they keep tabs on how much each candidate spends is quite interesting. At any one time, all the major party candidates are followed by videographers. They are, everywhere they go. So there's plenty of documentation of evidence that the Election Commission has and does, where about how many events and how big the events are, and then they have like a rate card. Okay, so using the rate card, they will say, okay, so you in this event it looks like there were 2000 people, so 2000 higher for 2000 chairs is so much. The stage seems to be 20 feet by 10 feet, so average stage would be so much. The average audio sort of system expenditure is so much, and then they have their own sort of running tally of how much your expenditure is. So every 2 weeks we go and match our tally. We will say, no, like, we only spent 8 lakhs, and they'll say, no, no, we have it as 13 lakhs. And so you reconcile these accounts. So actually, like, having said all of this, the Election Commission of India does take a lot of effort, does use up a lot of our resources to make sure the elections are fairly scrutinized. Right now, of course, there is a limit to how much they can do, but I've always been impressed with how well they've scrutinized individual candidates and individual candidates expenditure. To your point, Ruchir, of course, political parties, there is no limit, there is no cap. That's another dichotomy, right? So
yeah.
the 95 lakh is a cap on the candidate. The political party, like, if I am, my party is, let us say, has the symbol of a rose, I can take out ads for 200 days on all the major newspapers, just if I can do it, right? And there is no cap. So therefore, it is an interesting dichotomy there also. Why do we not restrict political party funding when we restrict individual candidate funding? As you said, level playing field, but then, any independent candidate, often, the idea is they do come in without resources, but that's not the case, right? Because you could have, let us say, for example, a extremely rich person, one of the richest people in the country, who wants to contest. They may come in with a lot more resources and funds also. So the idea is shaky. I think in the United States, for example, there is no cap, right? And I think the premium is on transparency. The premium, as you, Richard, pointed out, is on the making sure that every single rupee or dollar that is spent is accounted for, and every single rupee or dollar that is raised is generally, disclosed to the authorities. And I think that we do not do. A lot of it goes, I think, under the carpet and used as cash. So it's an interesting area. I think electoral reforms goes to the foundational questions of our democracy, right? And I don't think we have quite figured it out just yet. So here
Manu,
we
I
are.
I have a question out of academic interest. I mean, if your sense is that in this election we're going to see almost a doubling of election spend than we did in 2019, where is the bulk of the money getting routed? I mean, is this now becoming more and more a digital election, where you're spending on, whether it's AI or disseminating more information about yourself, or essentially campaigning online, or is it still very much nuts and bolts on ground spend?
So bit of both, right? It really depends on the kind of campaign one a person wants to run. I think the common sort of misunderstanding, if I've got it right, is that people think a lot of the money is just, cash for votes, right? Yeah, there is a lot of cash for votes culture, buying people things to come and vote for you, and so on and so forth. But an equal amount of money actually goes into ensuring that an entire election campaign runs. Now, how does this run, right? As you said, the nuts and bolts. So if you have a 30 to 40 day, which is the average campaign period for most elections, because we, let us say our election is notified early March, your candidates are probably announced, mid March, right? So from mid March to, late April is the time that you have. So 40, 45 days. And during that particular time, every single day, every constituency is between 1 and 1.5 to 2 million people. All right. So you are going to need at least, I would say anywhere between 600 to 800 people who need to sort of fan out across the constituency. So I'm the candidate, I can be in one spot, in a day, right? But I need these other 500, 600 people, if I can, to fan out across the constituency and make sure that they speak about me, they campaign for me, they talk to the voters there, they remind them about my party's promises and why the other party is a terrible idea and so on. So that entire election machinery, so over 40 days, 45 days, somehow needs to be compensated. They need to be, ensured, because these are people who are party workers. These are by and large volunteers, but they have given up their work. They've taken a leave without pay, or they're sort of doing this, maybe from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m., so on and so forth. So I think whether you're paying them money, or whether you're, paying their petrol, or whether you're buying them lunch and coffee and dinner, all of that, I think, requires a lot of money. And I think a lot of that, according to me, usually falls on the shoulders of the candidate, themselves, which makes it very difficult, right? Which makes it that each candidate is now shelling out in crores now to ensure that this election machinery is running, it's running well, and is well oiled, and for those 30, 40 days. So I think that's where most of the money is still going. I don't see yet a huge AI play. I think this will be the election where we will see how that comes. We are bracing ourselves for a lot of sort of deep fakes, a lot of um, I guess misinformation, or large scale misinformation campaigns, large scale sort of setting up of fake accounts and all of that. I think that is something we are keeping a very close watch on. Of course, the traditional misinformation or information machinery is still WhatsApp, right? That's what the biggest parties in the country are still relying on. That's the way you can still get word to the very, very farthest corner, because I've been told people are only watching, YouTube shorts, or on WhatsApp. These are the two things that you want to get on to make sure that you have a successful campaign. I think everything else is just padding for the campaign, but this is still the heart of it, like WhatsApp campaigns, and making sure people are on the ground for those last 30, 40, 45 days, walking around talking about you, ensuring that they're giving pamphlets, they're essentially making your case for you. I think that's how this entire machinery runs.
Fascinating. And as you said, better late than never. I know it's been 7 years coming, but at least it's here, right?
Richard, what do you think about corporate donations? I mean, of course, this electoral bonds has, I think, shown the light on that. But I mean, it doesn't stop there, right? Why shouldn't smaller companies, smaller businesses also increase political participation? I feel in our country, lack of political participation, or political apathy is usually fairly high. Why do I say that? Because we still rely on the biggest corporates to give political funding, right? That's still our go-to. But what about the smaller companies? What's the buzz in the startup world around political funding, donations, and so on?
It's very rare to find businesses or startups who like believe that donating to a political party will have meaningful impact on their business, right? I mean, ultimately, what is the objective for the business to give money to a political party? You want something in return, because the goal of that enterprise is to increase its valuation or to increase its profit. So is giving to a political party benefiting them, is like the question that has to be answered. And so for younger businesses where they're still finding their feet, they're still trying to figure it out, more likely than not, the donations they make are for getting something in return, some form of regulatory capture. That's why most younger businesses, smaller businesses, tend not to donate unless the founder is using business money for the personal political ideology or support. I think it is okay for businesses to donate, but it is also important that that is public knowledge, because
Exactly.
people should be able to judge that interest, whether there is something there or not. That is the point of a democracy, that people should have the information and then make an informed decision. So I think I'm not against businesses giving money, but I am also in favor of that being transparent. Manu, you want to take over?
I've got this. Yeah. So it's been an interesting sort of year. On one hand, we're discussing big corporate donations to political parties and election funding, and on the other hand, of course, in a repeat of 2021 farmers' protests, we've seen wide-ranging sort of protests led by various farmer groups, and sort of converging into the national capital region over the last 10 or 12 days. And of course, the timing of the protest was overlapped, or was supposed to overlap with the end of the parliament session, the last parliament session for this particular Lok Sabha. Now, I think a lot has been spoken about the farmers' protest, but I want to look at a few things, right? Firstly, um, the fundamental sort of aspect around this protest culture, and how protest culture has or has not impacted uh, political thinking. I think in the earlier discussion we spoke about some of the protests that happened earlier, including the India against corruption and whatnot. I'm comparing the two only for the sake of saying that they were both at that time and now not led by a political party, right? And they were sort of public interest issues. So the protest culture in itself, because that is, I think lot of people who've spoken against the farmers' protest have, said this is very disruptive. Is this how you ask for what you need? And is there not a more sort of patient and more sort of conducive way to make your demand? And the second part is the farmer piece itself, right? Because we've seen this in 2021. In fact, it was one of the few protests that I can remember in recent memory, which made the government of India stop in its tracks and, in fact, recall or repeal or withdraw three or four bills that were brought in to introduction in Parliament. So that was quite a momentous sort of an issue. And the third part, and maybe this is something that both of you can come up with because you both live overseas, is this sort of uh, you know calling the farmers protests and linking it with a separatist movement, right? The Khalistani movement. And we saw this more in 2021. I don't know how much of this is being played out now in across mainstream media, but is this part of a foreign funded, maybe a separatist movement, or what is the sort of connotation along that? So three parts: one, the protest culture and its sort of scope; secondly, how the farm issue or the agricultural issue has been a repeat issue; and third is this whole sort of Khalistani sort of stereotyping of it. So maybe Mitali first, then Ruchir.
Yeah. I actually want to add another element to the conversation, Manu, and it's sort of picking up on the point that you made earlier about misinformation. So there's so much conversation about misinformation and Where does it feed from? What is the impact of that? I think what we often don't accept, or we don't sort of see it as blatantly as it is out there, is that misinformation comes right from the top. And that is frankly the most dangerous kind of misinformation, and that is the kind of misinformation that can really cause rupture and damage in the social fabric of a country. I think the starting point of this protest has to be, is there legitimacy in what is going on, or in what is being asked for? So if you just look at it as the cause itself, the MSP, or the minimum support price, now this is something that the Modi government declares itself. For 23 crops, for every year, there is an MSP that is set out. So there is a mechanism, there is a price decided upon, and it's not sort of legally binding, but the government does point out that, it is their responsibility to support the farmers in terms of their price. I think the next question to ask is, so, what's going on here? How many farmers get it? From the numbers that I have read, and from the experts that I have read, it looks like it's a very, very small minority. I think it would be between one fourth to one fifth farmers that actually get that support, and on specific crops again. So then you come to the point that I'm making about misinformation, which is that when you read the popular narrative from the government's point of view, they have said that claiming this MSP will cost our government 17 lakh crores, that is almost half the union budget. This is completely out of whack with anything the government can spend. The first point is that is factually incorrect. You are basically costing this for the entire produce of every crop. You're valuing the crop at zero, and then you're coming to the conclusion that this is going to cost the government 17 lakh crores. I think a number of calculations have been done around this, where it's basically coming to around, um, you know, give or take, well, around 47,000. And then if you add some of the small, you take 13 major crops and then you take some minor crops, you come to at about a 50,000 crore spend in terms of what it would actually mean as a monetary bill for the government to pay if it was supporting farmers for these 13 odd crops. Uh, that's what the figure looks like. So my first problem over here, is with regards to misinformation. My second problem here, as you said, with public protest is, on the one hand, you're handing out these national laurels to MS Swaminathan. If your point is to have a conversation about this, then let's go back to the MS Swaminathan Commission recommendations and see what it is that they recommended in terms of MSP for farmers. Is there, validity in what they are asking for? Is there legitimacy in what they are asking for? Uh, my second problem, as you pointed to on public protests, is, and I know I've used this term before, but in this one, I think it really fits, which is again the dehumanizing. As a citizen of India, what are my rights to peacefully protest? And do my rights to peacefully protest imply that if I were to do so, I will be gated from the national capital of the country? Does it mean I will be attacked with air pellets that have caused severe injuries, and these are well documented? One young farmer has lost his life. This is a really, really difficult and dangerous cliff edge to be standing at when you're looking at public protests by the citizenry. Does it mean I do not have the right to voice what I think is my legitimate concern? And the third point, of course, on what you made about this othering, that's the only word I can use for it, Manu. And again, I would just say, as someone who, I'm the daughter of an army officer. I spent my whole life sort of traveling through India, and I say this quite honestly. I identify with every part of India. And this othering is so damaging because this is so against the fabric of what I believe the country is. So, on one side, you have the CAA protests, then they become, the Muslim terrorists. Then you have Punjab, or farmers from Punjab demanding something, they become the Khalistanis. Then you have a difference of opinion in South India, so let's carve out that space. I don't know what we're going to be left with at this rate. West Bengal, I'm not sure what we're called, but I'm sure we're called something, and I'm sure it's not sort of, polite. So, I'm just watching this from the outside with a lot of deep concern about how much we are ripping our social fabric on the one hand. But on the other, I have a serious problem with this level of misinformation that comes in where you blatantly speak mistruths, and you feed that into the system. And I think that's just not okay.
The whole concept of minimum support price is something that we take for granted because of the high regard we hold the agricultural community, right? But it's not every economist sort of preferred option or solution either. I mean, why should particular particular field get subsidies or get a minimum guaranteed price is something that I think torments still people who believe that market forces should determine what the prices are. If it's if tomatoes are very expensive one day, then you don't use tomatoes, right? And so on and so forth. So in addition to what you were going to say, Ruchir, I'm very keen to hear how you want to sort of interpret this whole minimum guaranteed price debate.
You basically asked the most important question in this conversation, like why this MSP, right? Effectively, the big problem in India that's not being tackled is 46%, 45 or 46% of our population is employed in agriculture, but our GDP is roughly around 14% from agriculture, and that gap is all these people are effectively working but not producing, right? And so the government has a big problem. How do we transition a big part of this population to other places where it can contribute a lot more to the economy? Fundamentally, we need to reskill a lot of the people in agriculture into other parts of economy where they can earn more and they can do more. So unless we think about that problem, we cannot take away income from farmers, and that's the big issue here. We are effectively not helping transition farmers out of agriculture, but then there is this threat to their earning potential. That's the crux of the issue, and I think we need to take a step back. The government needs to take a step back and think about that big picture. On the other thing, the quick point I want to make is I actually think there is a disconnect between the government leadership and whoever the disinformation people are. I actually think our external affairs minister and our prime minister are extremely conscious about the Khalistani separatism, and not wanting any element of that in India. And then there's this misinformation mafia, that the troll farms, they come out and start taking that piece on. I don't think it is a strategy of the government. I think there is a big disconnect there. I think we've got um, a few people who've basically trying to play that up on social media, and they've got it really wrong, because I don't think the leadership of the country wants that.
And there are protests, every couple of years there is, like I said, I go back to the India against corruption protests, right? So interestingly, what has come out of that, according to me, as a contribution, whether you think it's a positive or otherwise contribution to the country, is the Aam Aadmi Party, right? A lot of the leaders from there sort of coalesced and found common ground, common ideology. But the legislative or otherwise contribution of that movement, the either strengthening or creating a stronger lokpal or anything, or a greater sort of watchdog slash oversight mechanism against corruption. I mean, nothing really has come out of it. I don't think we can say that we are less corrupt as a country than we were in 2012 or 13 at the height of the Anna Hazare led movement. So I think it's important to understand where these sort of protests go. I think BJP as a political machinery has seen these protests. I think they handle them in a particular way. Like I said, the only thing that made them stop in their tracks was the farmers' protest 3 years ago. I don't know if that will sort of happen again. I know they've already come up with a couple of proposals to strike, strike some sort of midway point with the protesting farmer leaders. But yeah, so I think the protest will go ahead in a way that it might, but being this close to the election also, I don't know if it will sort of snowball into a massive countrywide movement, because that is sort of what I think many people who do not want to see the BJP win the election are hoping it would. um, Ruchir, last word to you, or do you want to get straight into have you
I,
heards?
I mean, Mitali, maybe you have something to add, and I'll give you the last word. I think that is a really important point, Manu. The point around elections. I don't think this will become a big issue because it's not in the interest of the party in power. I actually think that they will somehow find a way to manage these protests because they don't want farmers not in their side. Sorry, Mitali.
No, I was just going to say it's also interesting to me the parallels that are sort of playing out at this point, Manu, between what's happening in India and what's happening in Europe. For example, as you know, the European Commission had a raft of new ideas, including sort of halving the use of chemical pesticides by a particular year. And that really set off a lot of protests across Europe, whether it's the Czech Republic or Poland. There were farmers again marching out in protest, coming out on their vehicles, coming out at borders to protest. And just the difference in terms of how they've been seen and treated is quite interesting, to watch as an observer. And I think it's this. I take Ruchir's point about the fact that we need to move to a different form in terms of what our economy looks like. But at this point, frankly, if you were to look at what the backbone of our economy is and what has held us in good stead over the last few years, especially post COVID, it's the rural economy. Narega was a big backbone. What is being suggested now in terms of MSP, that 50,000 crore figure I spoke of, is about half of Narega. So essentially, I think you have to have you know a reality check of what you are as an economy. What do you look like? What do you constitute? What are your responsibilities? What does the majority of your electorate? How do they live and where do they live? And how are you going to support them? So I think I find that quite interesting, where you have all these images of farmers being hit with they have these pellet gun wounds on them, and you have the national capital with large concrete stones and barbed wire around it. um, I don't know, is this how we want to engage with our citizenry, election or no election you know
One of my joys in life is the right to protest, and I feel sad when I see those barbed wires. Anyway, all right, we move to the last topic, which is, have you heard Aapne Sunaa Kya? Manu, why don't you go first today?
All right. My state of Tamil Nadu is known to be the first of, in many events and issues, and rightly so. But I think we are going to be the first in something that not everyone is going to be very happy about. A few days ago, the government of Tamil Nadu has taken steps to ban uh, cotton candy, which is popularly sold, as you know, across the state and many parts of the country, because it contains rhodamine B, which is a suspected carcinogen and is something that is obviously not very good. Having sort of now taken a cue from Tamil Nadu, I believe other states, including Andhra Pradesh, Pondicherry, and even Delhi, are now testing for cotton candy in their own states to see whether it has rhodamine B. Now, what I really found quite fascinating or shocking in equal parts is that rhodamine B is actually like a chemical compound and a dye, right? Which has some fluorescent properties. So it's actually used or mixed with water to give a pink color. Now, of all the things that you can mix into a sugary treat for children, it sounds like the strangest thing that we have now started mixing in. So rhodamine B, which is used to identify whether raccoons have actually been vaccinated, or have been given rabies vaccine or not, is something which apparently I've eaten a lot when I was a child. So I have now heard that rhodamine B will be banned here on in from Tamil Nadu, and so that's the end of cotton candy.
I'll go next. For all the podcast listeners, if you like listening to a podcast, I recommend you actually hear this on a podcast in Radio Lab. A host called Latif Nasir presented this show. The episode is called Zoo's Way. Um, Actually, you can skip it if you want to listen to that podcast. If you don't, it was really interesting. This podcast host saw Zoo's Way return around Venus, and he, like some of us who like astronomy, didn't know there was a moon that Venus had. So he goes deep into finding this moon. Turns out this graphic designer misread 2002 VE, which was a quasi moon someone had discovered in the year 2002. Um, he'd seen that as a moon and put it down as a Zuzwe on the poster, ZOOZVE. Through the reporting in the episode, he actually discovers that the this is a quasi moon of Venus called 2002 VE, and ends up applying to the International Astronomical Union for naming rights. And because of this story, it actually gets named Zuzwe. So now Venus has a quasi moon named Zuzwe. I thought that was such a cool story. Anyway, over to you, Mitali.
That is fascinating. And first, I want to say thank you to sort of my co panelists for putting these suggestions out. Manu, last weekend I watched Karthal and I loved it. I really, really loved it. It was so deep and it was so human and humane. It was both those things. And I absolutely loved watching it. So thank you for the recommendation. Um, I think I'm sticking with things to watch, and I want to recommend a series on Netflix called One Day. It's based on a book and also on a film from a previous time. And I know I'm sort of constantly displaying how old I am, but I love it because it's very much set in the 1980s and the 90s, and it's so much of how all of us grew up. And I think it's also fantastic because I love how popular culture is now being so intentional about being quite diverse and international in what they represent. And I think I really that's what I love about it. The fact that the lead is a South Asian woman, I think could mean so much for young South Asian girls who are watching this sort of popular culture and seeing themselves reflected when they look at something on the screen. So One Day, which is on Netflix, is keep your tissues handy, but I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you. That's all we have for the fifth episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can do this better. Please share your feedback at indiadialoguepodcast@gmail.com, or find any one of us on social media and you can message us. The podcast is at TID, which is the India Dialogue, TID underscore podcast on x.com, formerly Twitter, or India Dialogue Podcast on YouTube. Mitali is on Mitali Live. Manu is on Manuraj1983. I am on Ruchir underscore P. Thank you again for joining us this week. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.